welcome to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. I'm glad you've made the connection and are with us today. I'm Laurie Fitz, your host, and the goal of our show is to explore a wide range of topics that challenge us to see ourselves, our community, and the world around us in ways that get us thinking, get us connected, and perhaps inspired or challenged to do just a bit more because we've made the connection. And as we celebrate Black History Month, today's conversation will be on truth, freedom, and justice. Our show today has been co-produced with Kit Bix, and both this week and next week's show is part of the ongoing series of Jewish Voices. Thank you so much, Kit, for all that you do. And Kit may have got her on mute. Kit?
Can you hear me?
Now we can. Hi, Kit.
Yeah. Sorry. Hi, everybody. Okay.
Well,
proceed.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kit. Our co-host is Sheree Curry. Sheree is an award-winning journalist and founder of the forum blackandjewish.org. She's also co-president of the National Association of Black Journalists Minnesota. She has been a staff reporter at Fortune, associate editor at Advertising Age, correspondent with People, and the Wall Street Journal, as well as publications in Israel while living there. And her articles on culture, business, and diversity have also been published in USA Today, Entrepreneur, Star Tribune, and others. She has a master's degree in journalism from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And in 2025, she was named Minneapolis-St. Paul Business Journal Women in Business. It's been a delight working with you on this two-part series, Sheree. And you've invited Robin Washington to join us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being able to come here to speak for Black History Month, as well as to talk about the relations between Blacks and Jews. And you mentioned Robin, and Robin and I are both Black, and Jewish. And during this time, Black History Month, we're celebrating 100 years. It started out as, earlier as a Black History Week, as Black History Month. Now, it's not just history, right? It's a living history, and Black history is for all Americans. It's not just for Blacks. So I've known Robin a long time, Robin Washington. So it's a pleasure to be able to have him as a guest. Robin, he created this documentary back in 1995. You Don't Have to Write Jim Crow, about the first freedom ride and the impact of Irene Morgan's refusal to yield her seat on a bus from Virginia to Maryland in July 1944. We'll hear a little bit from him about that. Also, as I mentioned, Robin is also Jewish. He is a moderator with me on the blackandjewish.org. He is a former editor-in-chief of the Duluth News Tribune, and currently he is a columnist for the Star Tribune with an article in today's paper that we're going to speak about a little bit later as well. And he is an editor-at-large at the Jewish publication The Forward and a radio host for Wisconsin Public Radio. He is also the parliamentarian of the National Association of Black Journalists Minnesota, where I am the co-president. But most importantly, I have to say this, Robin was also the guest speaker at my oldest son's bar mitzvah. So it was a pleasure to have Robin speak there. When we first, around the time, in our first time that we met at a journalism conference at the National Association of Black Journalists, and Robin was so excited to tell me that there are other Black and Jewish journalists who are also there. And he went around the conference with me until we found 10 of us so that we could have a minyan at the journalism conference. So, Robin, it's such a pleasure to be able to do this with you today.
Thank you, Sheree. And all we need now is 8 more.
Well, 7 maybe. You've got Kit, you, and Sheree. So we're all good.
We're getting there.
So tell me a little bit about the Black and Jewish histories and how they've shaped our moments in history.
Well, actually, there'll be a lot of discussion about it, or there already is. Right now, there's a documentary series hosted by Henry Louis Gates of Finding Your Roots fame at Harvard University called Black and Jewish America. And the title might be a bit confusing because some people are thinking it's about Sheree and me, Black and Jewish Americans. But it's not. It's about Blacks who are not Jews and Jews who are not Black. I stress that because when you say Black and Jewish, you need to be careful that the terms are not mutually exclusive. There are a lot of people like Sheree and me. So when you say Black people, you don't necessarily mean not Jewish. Likewise, Jewish could be Black, could be any color, and in fact it is. It's a very multicultural religion. Uh, but in any case, if you want to talk about the history of both groups, I mean, again, that conversation is happening. It goes, well, frankly, it goes back way before the documentary series covers. It goes back to the beginning of Judaism. I mean, people were of all different colors back when Judaism began. Of course, Judaism began, if you want to be biblical, when the world began, but not so long after that, I guess, would be Abraham and the whole 9 yards, the story of there. But in all seriousness, you're talking about the Middle East, right? And then from the Middle East, people left and went different places, and they also stayed there. And, you know, if you went south, you went into Africa. If you went north, you went into Europe, and you went every direction. And obviously, the way human beings behave, you join with other people in those areas you are, and you become every color there is. So that's sort of the beginning of, quote, Black and Jewish relations, close quote. But obviously, in the United States, there are some very distinct and inspiring stories.
Yeah. Thank you, Robin. And I know when we talk about the Black and Jewish relations from going back to the civil rights era, we often hear about how much Jews were aligned with the causes for civil rights causes and allies of Black Americans at that time. And that PBS special that you mentioned, the Black and Jewish America series, speaks a little bit to that as well. What's your thought? Because without going too much into your own personal history, but you have done some research on that as well about the Black and Jewish alliances in the civil rights era.
Well, I've not only done research, I've lived it. I grew up in a civil rights movement family. My mother was an officer of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality in Chicago, and also of the NAACP. There were CORE and NAACP meetings in our living room. And wow. I was sitting there playing with toy trains while she and her colleagues were figuring out sit-ins and boycotts and things. Not so much what boycotts to various actions in the height of the civil rights movement. This would have been the early 60s. So the other thing I would point out, both in the documentary series and in reality, is the relationships between I would say, again, the larger Black community and the Jewish community, keeping in mind always that there are overlaps of both, doesn't begin with the civil rights movement. Take me, for example. I was born in 1956. The movement had just begun. Obviously, my parents, one of whom was African-American and not Jewish, the other one Jewish and not African-American, found each other before I was born, right? And my brother was 3 years earlier, so that should tell you something. But in the documentary series, to its credit, it goes back way further than that. It's not, just Jews coming to the aid of Blacks in the civil rights movement or for causes for Black liberation. The converse happened in the early 20th century. Black newspapers were editorializing against pogroms going on in Europe. And so, this is a two-way street, and the two groups have always been basically allied against what? Oppression and discrimination, because both have been victims of oppression and discrimination. That has ebbed and flowed over the centuries and certainly over the decades, and there's different manifestations. Not always were both of them dealing with the same type of discrimination or oppression. But the bottom line is, those who are racist are probably pretty much overlapped with those who are anti-Semitic. And you can go throughout history and find this. And at the end of the day, both groups are fighting the same fight.
In discussing the Black and Jewish America series on PBS, Henry Louis Gates Jr., I pulled a quote from him that aligns so well with what you've just shared. Black and Jewish America, an interwoven history, is a 4-part series tracing the rich, complex relationship between Black and Jewish Americans, defined by solidarity and strained by division. Drawn together by racism and anti-Semitism, they forged a civic and cultural bonds, especially during the Civil Rights era. And the series explores both the challenges and the enduring promise of the alliance. And I'm fascinated with you growing up in the civil rights movement. My mom was very active as well, and I always said that I learned how to walk in a march. So and she was active in the late 50s with helping with the desegregation of schools. So there was, a powerful movement that started with civil rights and with both Jewish and blacks being, there was prejudice. So there was a reason to come together, but there was something more. Tell me about that.
Well, again, and our backgrounds are pretty much shared because, by the way, the fight against segregation in schools, particularly in the North, I know there was a co-author of an article in the NAACP Crisis magazine in 1958 called De Facto Segregation in Chicago Public Schools. And this article was actually sort of a framing of the movement of the civil rights movement, if you will, or shifting from the South of legislated de jure segregation to the North de facto, i.e. the way neighborhoods were, right? There were black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods, and they had different, each had their own schools. What she had found, by the way, getting into this a little bit, is that the school districts were drawn around racial boundaries, so that the northern school districts, certainly in Chicago, were perpetuating segregation. And the call was for known school districts, which today, finally, that kind of happens with magnet schools. But not to digress, although when you're born in this, you learn all about it and you learn all the details. So again, and one thing maybe that isn't publicized, and I could go back into her works and her archives, by the way, she's passed away 20 years, is there were also Jewish schools segregated, at least in Chicago. We had a particular school built, she would always say, Mather was built to bring the, Mather High School, to bring the Jews out of Amundsen. And she would say this as fact, and as a journalist, I've gone back and say, wait a minute, they couldn't have done that. And I find paperwork, guess what, that's what happened. So you hear this a lot, that Jews joined the civil rights movement because it was their interest, as well as being the interests of African Americans. And that's true.
And often protections had been failed for both.
Absolutely. I mean, you get into things like quotas. My mother went to Middlebury College, and at that time, and she would say these phrases trickingly off the tongue. And again, I'd come back 30 years later and say, wait a minute, what did she just say? What did she say back then? She was one of 2 Jews admitted to Middlebury every year, and there were 2 blacks. So, this was blatant. I wrote a piece for the Forward once. The Forward is the premier Jewish publication online, going back 125 years, actually 127 now. And originally the Daily Yiddish Forward, and the Yiddish Daily Forward. And one of my co-editors asked me, what year did they get rid of quotas at Jewish quotas and black quotas at Ivy League schools? And I said, no, they didn't write it. There was no resolution or anything because the stuff was never written down. And so this is how pervasive it was in society. And I'm sure in your family and mine, when you were fighting this, you were fighting stuff that indeed was practiced, not necessarily written down. In the South, it was written down. So in a weird way, that was easier.
I'll jump in with that, Robin, too, because with pitching this with the South and how people. My mother grew up in Alabama until she was about 15 when the family migrated north to Chicago. But she grew up. She was born in 1947, so there were separate water fountains for obviously we know for Black people. There was redlining continued with housing in terms of who could own land or who could buy certain houses or not. And Jews faced some of the same situations as well in America. When my mother moved, she was about 15 when she moved to Chicago. And that was the first time that she was in a school with white people, some of whom were Jewish people as well, in that part of the South Side of Chicago. And I know that when we talk about, again, where those alliances kind of come from, as Jews also were fighting about where they could live, in which homes they could buy or not. It helped to build the two together, but at some point we know that there was a shift between that strength of an alliance in the middle of a civil rights protest to later when we go to, I'm going to go to like New York with there in Crown Heights in the 1990s between Blacks and Jews. It kind of erupted. And so from your perspective, where did some things fall apart and why between the alliance between Black Christians, I'll say, and white Jews?
Well, I would say Black. I wouldn't delineate Christians or not. Again, I'm saying Black people, just saying keep in mind that Black people includes all kinds of religions. Jews includes all kinds of races. So you can talk about Blacks and Jews, but remember that you're not excluding either from each one, okay? And as far as when it fell apart, it constantly falls apart, okay? There are people arguing all the time. You take any two groups of people and they don't agree on something, even if they're in an alliance, and it comes back together again. That's, if anything, you're going to jump to what it all means and tell you, it means, you know what, we actually care about each other because we wouldn't be worrying about the divisions if we didn't, right? If I can't stand you and then I get into a fight, good, go, bye. I don't need you anymore. But guess what? Blacks and Jews keep coming back to each other, right? And so there's periods in which there's great cooperation, there's great, intermingling. I am the result of intermingling, okay? So, there's literal evidence of that. And there's other times when we can't stand each other. It's because some of the, priorities changed. The quota system, for instance, because of the history that Jews had of, Ivy League, only 2 Jews were allowed or whatever, each college or something like that. When affirmative action first began, in the very first days, under, by the way, I would say the Nixon administration, so the politics are not necessarily what you think they would be. There were actually quotas for like construction contracts with the federal government. And they said, this lasted for about a minute, seriously, just a couple of years. But there were set-aside contracts for Black companies, small companies. And by the way, there were front companies that were pretending to be Black that would hire one Black president and have all white staffs, immediately taking advantage of this and doing what, is a big word in Minnesota these days, fraud, okay? But Jews reacted to this, or Jewish organizations, because, wait a minute, quotas kept us out. So now you're having a quota and we're not included in, fine. But so that was one point of division, okay? It changed later on when quotas went away. And they didn't go away because of Jewish protests over it. They went away because of attacks against affirmative action and all. And that, of course, continues today with attacks against DEI and all. By the way, the pure meaning of affirmative action since that time has simply meant expanding the pool of either applicants for a job or contractors or something, so that you cast a broad net of people you're looking for to do whatever work this is, or schools or whatever, to attend. And if you cast a broad net, you'll have, a diverse type of pool of applicants. It doesn't mean you have to hire or admit to your school any particular person. It doesn't mean, again, without quotas, that you have to have 3 Jews or 4 Blacks or whatever. It simply means that you take affirmative action, that's what the words mean, to at least look for them. And frankly, even though it sounds rather didactic, what I just said is very rarely understood by opponents of affirmative action. All you hear is, well, they have to hire Black people. And it's simply not true.
Robin, you bring to light so many important ideas, and I'm looking forward to having us go into our second segment. But I also want to mention that I think both you and Sheree are celebrations of the Jewish and Black community coming together, and not just sort of an iteration, but an actual celebration. And delighted
Well,
to
let
have
me
you
jump
both.
off of that very quickly to say that's another thing that binds the two groups is, I mean, humor. I mean, Jewish, Black comedians. You know, if you took away them, you wouldn't have comedy. Okay?
That's true. It's true.
Them, you, by the way, wouldn't have much left in music either. You know, so the collaborations are many, many, many. And again, when you go back and forth between "I love you," "I can't stand you," you know, it's like a marriage.
It is.
And
It is.
there are these points of fissure, but there's so many commonalities. And if the two groups didn't care about each other, we wouldn't be talking about it.
Exactly. And it
I'll
makes it
just
real.
say that some of them, we talk about the comedy and the music, it's also where society, I mean, mainstream society, decades ago, allowed us to participate. It was okay to white society to hear our music, to see us dance, to see us do comedy, even to the extent, right, that we're talking about there was blackface where they wanted to imitate that. We were not in some of the circles of business. So this is where we were allowed to show up among the two groups or create your own business, which is what we saw. The number of Black entrepreneurs, the number of Jewish entrepreneurs who had to start their own banks, their own colleges, looking at, right, historically Black colleges and universities, looking at yeshivas, Jewish universities. So there are certain spaces that we were allowed to be in with among mainstream, and then there were others that we had to create for ourselves.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Well, with that, we will leave this segment and come back in just after a few short commercials to support our show here, and talk more a little bit about a documentary that you helped to create. Robin, I'm looking forward to hearing the background on You Don't Have to Ride Jim Crow, the documentary, and also talk a little bit about some of the challenges facing Black journalists today. So with that, we'll be back in just a few short minutes. Welcome back to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. I'm so glad that you've joined the conversation today. In our show, we are going to be continuing the discussion on truth, freedom, and justice. It is part of the Jewish Voices series, co-produced by Kit Bix, which we deeply appreciate her support. And my co-host today is Sheree Curry. She's an award-winning journalist and founder of the forum on blackandjewish.org. She's also co-president of the National Association of Black Journalists, Minnesota. She was staff reporter at Fortune. She was associate editor at Advertising Age, correspondent with People and the Wall Street Journal, as well as publications in Israel while living there. Welcome, Sheree. So glad you're here.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I'm so happy to be joined with Robin Washington as well, who is also on the board of NABJ Minnesota. And I'm going to add one thing, Laurie. You mentioned, that I lived in Israel and worked in Israel. And I worked there in journalism as well, covering immigration. Oh. So there was the airlift of Ethiopian Jews around that time as well as a lot of Russian Jews who came into Israel, and looking at the dynamic of how the country absorbed Black Jews from Ethiopia and these white Jews who came in from Russia was a very interesting experience as well. And being there as a Black Jewish person, and how Ethiopian Jews, kind of looked at me and was like, you're our cousin, and how the two groups of immigrants kind of interacted with each other, and it just really kind of brings the story forward with, some of what we're doing today. But I know with Robin's journalism, with both of our journalism, and how we cover some of these issues. Robin writes for, let's say, the Forward which is a Jewish publication. Actually, I believe it started out as a Yiddish publication. And he's also a columnist with the Star Tribune. And there is so much the impact of journalism and how it has had on the, the storytelling of any kind of community. So just as I was telling stories about the Ethiopian Jews and the Russian Jews in Israel, and then the starting of also this blackandjewish.org as a forum and a way for us to kind of tell our stories. Robin, you want to jump in as well about how journalism impacts the telling of stories from Blacks or Jews or just in general, and how that moves us forward and as well as impacts history?
Well, if you'll indulge me, I'm talking about myself, that I had a soundbite I was giving a few years ago, and it's still true today, that I am personally driven by 3 J's: Judaism, journalism, and justice. And they all influence each other. They coincide at certain points. And so, my justice is informed by my Judaism, and my journalism keeps in mind justice, and it goes on and on, sort of a concentric Venn diagram or something like that.
The intersection.
So, seriously, the intersection of them. Mm-hmm. So it manifests itself, again, speaking for myself, in the stories that attract me to cover in most of my coverage, by the way. With all those titles you just threw out about me, Sheree, thank you very much. Yeah. I'm supposed to be semi-retired. It's not working very well. I have at least 3 half-time jobs, but the luxury of it, and I'm blessed at this point in my career, that I can actually pretty much choose myself what my stories will be. And so I gravitate toward those that, have one of those 3 J's or something, or I can look at through those lenses.
Well, as you talk about justice and understanding justice, is there one really important lesson that you learned both from your parents that guides your journalism today?
I would say it's not necessarily something that you consciously practice, but it is definitely subconsciously. So one thing I learned is the nature of protest. Some time ago, I wrote an article, a column for the Scrib on the nature of protest. That's what it was called. And my attitude toward protesters is different than other journalists, I've noticed. And so a real example of this was during the, first of all, I worked in Boston at the Boston Herald, in the bitter newspaper war against the Boston Globe during the Catholic Church sex abuse crisis in 2002, 2003. And I covered the victims, I think, it's not bragging or anything like this, it's a reality, closer than I would say any other reporter in the country. I was at the formation of victims groups, and they confided in me. And the reason, likely, was the nature, if you will, of my covering the nature of protests. In the very beginning, bear with me for the story because it is informative. I remember we were, to refresh people on the Catholic Church sex abuse crisis, it was over the revelation that Cardinal Law in Boston had moved around priests who were accused of child sex abuse. Instead of putting them on ice or getting rid of them or whatever, just moved to another parish. In the very beginning, we thought there were a few priests, and now we know it's endemic and it's a scourge on the Catholic Church, unfortunately, and not just Catholics by any means whatsoever. And Judaism has its issues too. But in any case, so in the very beginning, there was when the scandal broke, there was a convocation of priests from the Archdiocese of Boston, and out in front was one lone protester. And I showed up at the venue, and I asked the other journalists, "Who's he?" And they said, "Oh, he's some guy who says he was abused by a priest." I said, "Well, are you getting the story?" Nobody knows who the priest was, and I think he's dead or something like that. Okay, so he's kind of being dismissed. But it wasn't Minnesota weather, but it was Boston weather. It was January. It had to be no more than 20 degrees. I'm looking at this guy freezing to death out there, and I'm thinking, he's out there for a reason. And for me, protesters were not strange people. They were not unusual. This is my point, the answer to your question, right? So I went up to him and I said, "What's your story?" I'm not even sure I wrote about it that first day, but I got to know who he was. Well, it turns out the priest he named was indeed named by other people as it went along, okay? And actually, there was a second priest involved who was a big deal. And this guy became a leader of the victims movement. He was highly credible. And it was only because of my view of the world where protesters were, just because you're out there with a sign doesn't mean you're a kook. That I was able to look at them as human beings. And I, again, put in, the empathy of, it's cold. Why is he out there? You can apply that 100% to what we're dealing with in Minnesota right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's, yeah.
I love the idea of protesters being protectors and how they're being, more of that term's being coined here in Minnesota. And being able to see from your background and growing up in the civil rights, the protection of rights is so important. And I interrupted you, Sheree. Go ahead.
And I wanted to say about, once again, Robin, with the role that journalism plays in this. You talked about the role you had in helping to bring to light the story of what was going on in the Catholic Church. And, we can look at that, throughout history, the role of journalism. I look at, the 1955 murder of Emmett Till and how, his mother said, let the newspapers print the photo, of her son and the violence that occurred against him that caused his death. And the Black press was a part of that helped bring that to light. And when we bring that forward to today, just looking at the history of journalism as well, and we can talk about independent journalists. So like Georgia Ford here in our community, who was arrested, for covering an aspect of what was going on with the protests. Don Lemon, a national journalist who was in town for that as well at that same protest, who was also arrested without documentation, as we say, without the reporting from journalists, independent journalists, and now just people on the street, as well. We need the documentation to help bring these stories, to the general public to know what is actually going on. I write about some of these issues. You write about some of these issues today, Robin. So how important is journalism in telling these stories?
Well, if you don't have journalists telling the stories, who's going to know what happened? And also you'll have many different versions of what happened. And of course, that's the challenge today, because forget about what you and I write in the mainstream newspaper or radio station, whatever. Most people are getting their news by some kind of social media feed, and it might be true, it might not, it might be completely nutty. I'll give you a wonderful example, or a ridiculous example. One day my wife was looking at her Facebook feed, and she goes, "Oh, Alice Cooper died." And I go, "No, he didn't." And then about 3 minutes, not even 30 seconds later, she says, "Oh, you're right." Okay, how did I know that Alice Cooper didn't die? First of all, I was used to Facebook killing a lot of people who haven't died yet, okay, all the time. Secondly, my feed happens to be, many of my friends and Sheree's friends are the same people, happen to be journalists. And so because I have so many journalists in my feed, if Alice Cooper died, one of my friends would have been posting, "Here's my story about Alice Cooper dying." Okay, so since I didn't see any feed from my friends, my journalists, I knew right away that wasn't true. Okay, and it took her about, again, 30 seconds to find out it wasn't. So, this is a crossroads we're in, because on the one hand, journalism, traditional journalism, legacy journalism is attacked. Well, who are these gatekeepers who decide what we see and what's, real or not? But on the other hand, we're in the Wild West right now, with anything being posted. And of course, even worse now with AI, right? Because you don't know what you're seeing. You can see my face and my mouth moving, saying certain words that I never said,
But it is a dangerous escalation right now. We've got the Trump administration attacking the press. And frankly, black journalists being the ones that are, first targeted, it's a clear threat to the First Amendment, but also escalating racism.
All of the above.
Yeah.
And we've seen, right, from journalists, also female journalists as well, right, being called stupid and ugly and piggy. We've heard that from the federal government as well.
You can say his name unless you don't want to say his name.
No, we can say Trump. We can say Trump.
No, it's actually important to attribute that to one person, because nobody else is saying this. Nobody else is posting.
That is true. That is true. But his racism, even as yesterday, posting that horrible video of Barack and Michelle. I mean, that's just blatant, horrible racism there.
Right. The problem is that it normalizes this behavior. I mean, I'll give you, I won't go into a long story about it, but the point is, I think psychologists would tell you, don't need psychologists, that if I mention something abhorrent, right, you will be shocked at first. But then once the shock is over, I can keep mentioning it and you get used to it.
Normalizing it. Continue to normalize it. Yeah.
And so that's what our president does. He mentions unthinkable, unsayable things, and now once he said it, it can be said and other people pick it up, and it emboldens people who would have said this anyway, but felt, well, gee, I better not. Oh, now I can, because that's out there. So
yeah, and I know when we talk about with the targets, whether it's women or Somalis, immigrants, Black journalists, when these things are said, even Muslims and Jews are being attacked, in the media and in society. Our entire society is being weakened in whose voices can be heard. And I wrote a column, a commentary in the Star Tribune back in December that kind of talked about that from, using the German pastors saying, like, first they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, until then they came for me, right? And there was no one left to speak for me. And I feel the same way with it for journalism, so it's individual communities, but then it also becomes coming after the journalists as well. And if the journalists aren't here to help speak for the community and tell those stories, it erodes, how much we feel about what is truth, what is fiction, out there in our society. And I know, Robin, you wrote a piece in today's paper, in the Star Tribune. You wrote a piece in the Star Tribune about, are there ICE at a particular hotel in town or not? And protesters were forming there. You want to tell us a little bit about how your journalism helps impact what stories are being told in that regard?
So the piece is about how we stayed in a ICE hotel, if you will, in St. Paul. This is, you got breaking news here. This was Thursday night, and yesterday morning, Friday morning. I did get a tip. Journalists get tips. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay. Doesn't matter, by the way, if the tip is from a wonderful person or a terrible person. If something is happening, you want to know about it. And so the tip was that there would be a protest at the downtown St. Paul Hotel because ICE agents were staying there. So I had this in the back of my mind, by the way, because you've heard about ICE agents staying in hotels. But wait a minute. Okay. Obviously, you've heard, what hotels they are, and the protesters are out there banging pots and pans to keep them up at night and stuff like that. But didn't I say, and the word I may not have used was empathy, when I told the story a minute ago about the lone protester in front of the meeting of the priest of the Archdiocese of Boston Code, right? So I had empathy, not sympathy. I didn't necessarily feel sorry for him or anything like that, but I understood, something important was going on with him, that he was going to be out there in the cold. Guess what? I have empathy for ICE agents too. Some people would say, what's he talking about? No, I mean, these are human beings, right? They're in this situation, whether they volunteer for it, they're getting paid their bonuses, which, by the way, I'm told that they maybe get $10,000 at first, and the next $50,000 is conditional. So it may not be the bonus they think, but that's a different story. But there are human beings behind those masks. Well, who are those human beings behind those masks? And where's a place you might find out? How about the hotels where they're staying? They're not walking around the hotels in masks, are they? They can't go to the breakfast bar wearing a mask, can you? So it's been in the back of my mind for a while to check into a hotel that is, frequented by ICE or contracted by ICE. And when I got the tip there was a protest, obviously this was one of the hotels. You want to know what happened? You have to read the comments. Sorry.
And with that, we'll close out this segment. But on the next segment, I do want to talk a little bit more about that whole concept of protest and how that was played out in the documentary that you supported. So I want to learn a little bit about what led you to do that documentary and a little bit about that documentary as well. So we'll be right back just after a few short commercials. Welcome back to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. And we've been having great conversation today on truth, freedom, and justice. The show is co-produced with Kit Bix. She has been a producer for us for the series on Jewish Voices, which will continue next week as well. My co-host is Sheree Curry. She is an award-winning journalist and founder of the blackandjewish.org. She's also president of the National Association of Black Journalists in Minnesota. And we also have Robin Washington. He created the 1995 documentary You Don't Have to Ride Jim Crow about the first Freedom Ride and the impact of Irene Morgan's refusal to yield her seat on a bus from Virginia to Maryland in July 1944. And her arrest led to the 1946 U.S. Supreme Court case Morgan v. Virginia, banning segregation in interstate travel. Washington is Jewish. He's a former editor-in-chief of the Duluth News Tribune, currently a columnist for the Star Tribune, and his article, as he mentioned in the last segment, is in today's Star Tribune. So welcome to you both. Thank you for being here.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
A question for you about what drew you to the documentary that you created on Irene.
So I grew up, as we mentioned several times, in the civil rights movement, and all these meetings were in my house. I knew the people who were out on the front lines and everything and leading stuff. I became a journalist, and for one short period of my life, when I got laid off, it happens in journalism, I was looking for a job and got something in communications, public relations for a peace organization called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which it turned out had been a progenitor of several of the civil rights groups in the 1940s. I learned the history of the organization and found out the existence of a freedom ride, whites and blacks traveling in the South, purposely violating segregation laws, but not in the 1960s, in the 1940s, which I hadn't known about. I hadn't grown up in the 60s. And then I realized the riders were still alive. And although this was my one foray away from journalism as public relations or communications for this organization, I ended up doing the most journalistic thing in my life and created a documentary about this freedom ride. And as you mentioned, Irene Morgan brought it to it in a second, that reciprocated it. I'll say Irene right now. She was an African-American woman who was traveling between Maryland and Virginia and back to Virginia, Maryland. And she got on a bus in Virginia. She sat in the back where she was supposed to sit. And as the bus got crowded, more and more crowded, the driver said, "Give up your seats." And she said, no. She was already in the back. And so she was removed from the bus, and she resisted. When the sheriff and sheriff's deputy came on, she said that he put his hands on me, and that's when I kicked him. And so she was not violent. But long story short, it led Thurgood Marshall and Spotswood Robinson, two NAACP lawyers, took her case. They were looking for a case like this. And they argued it, ended up in the Supreme Court, bear with me for a little technical stuff, not saying segregation was wrong, but saying that forcing her to move between different seats as the bus crossed in different state lines with different rules, Maryland was integrated, and Virginia was not, was an undue burden on commerce, as described in the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. And so because of that, the Supreme Court agreed and outlawed segregation in interstate travel between the states as an undue burden on commerce. They didn't say that segregation was wrong. They simply said Maryland and Virginia couldn't enforce each laws on each other. And just like if you were sending a crate of oranges from Maryland to Virginia, it wouldn't move around at different parts of the freight car, right? So why would a human being have to move too? So this was decided. But that was on June 3rd, 1946. On June 4th, 1946, things hadn't really changed in the South, and we weren't enforcing this. So a group of really, they were gentlemen wearing suits and fedoras and all, but they were wild-eyed radicals, and they were black and white, and one was Jewish, by the way, and 16 men, 8 black, 8 white, decided to test the Irene Morgan decision by buying interstate tickets and traveling through the South and seeing what would happen. In short, again, I found the survivors of that ride. There were 10 alive when I started. 3 died before we could start shooting. I raised the money. We put them on a bus, had them relive their trip, and shot it for PBS. And that's You Don't Have to Ride.
How wonderful.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Laurie.
That's fine. Well, all I was going to say is that it's a wonderful example of how journalists can share the story and how important the story is. And I wanted to go back to you, Sheree, for that. In looking at the responsibility of journalists in telling the story and bringing that to life, what now gives you your hope when there's so much heaviness?
Like I said, the role of journalists, is very important in these times. And I'm going to also say, when we talk about Black journalists or Latino journalists, Asian American journalists, and journalists who are just out in the community. We have here in town the Sahan Journal, which covers a lot of immigrant and refugee communities, and people who can really identify and build these connections with people. Not saying that mainstream journalists do not mainstream, meaning white journalists at mainstream publications, but the role of journalism is important overall. But definitely when you talk about the coverage of ethnic communities and how important that is when you kind of identify with that. So what brings me that hope is journalists are not stepping back. So even though people say that maybe we're not telling the truth, what is real journalism, what is not journalism, we're under attack, but we will still be out there covering these stories and seeking that truth without that spotlight for readers, and hoping that readers can kind of understand what is actually going on. That's the important role. And it encourages me when I hear journalists say, despite these attacks, and despite layoffs, the Washington Post just laid off a bunch of journalists, they will find a way to then do their independent work and still bring stories forward.
And can I also encourage you to share a little bit about what our show will be next week?
Oh, yes. Thank you. So part 2, we will have Dr. Uhuru Williams, founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas, on as a guest. And he was one of the experts in Dr. Henry Louis Gates' PBS series on Black and Jews. And he's a civil rights history, phenomenon. He just has everything in his head. So can't wait.
And it'll be wonderful. And Robin, thank you so much for sharing your story, sharing your insights, and being with us today. We so appreciated having you be with us and be able to highlight your life career, as well as share some insights for us to be thinking about for the week and making those connections. So thank you to all. We look forward to having everyone join us next week on Connections Radio Show, the AM 950 Progressive Voice of Minnesota.